Hi everyone, and welcome to the Self Manager Hub forum. Is this the end for self and plan management? We're going to be talking about the NDIS review recommendations and how you can have your say. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet today and acknowledge that these lands were never ceded. I pay my respects to the Noongar people of the Wadandi region, the traditional custodians of the lands I'm joining you from today. I'd also like to pay our respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. So we'll have a closer look at the recommendations in the independent NDIS review around provider registration. So the review report recommended mandatory provider registration for all providers. There would be no more plan management and that we would pay for most supports using an NDIS card, which would be similar to an FPOS card or the high cap system, which is used for paying for Medicare and private health insurance claims. The report recommended 4 different levels of registration. Advanced registration, which would be for high risk supports, things like daily living supports in group homes. General registration for medium risk supports, things like high intensity daily personal activities, complex bowel care or injections, and supports with significant one-on-one contact with people with disability. Basic registration would be for lower risk supports, things like sole traders, smaller organisations, social and community participation supports, and supports with more limited one-on-one contact with people with disability. And the bottom level is enrolment. This would be for the lowest risk supports, things like consumables, equipment, technology, home and vehicle modifications, gardeners and cleaners. These recommendations are part of recommendation 17. So a closer look at what would be required with the 3 levels of registration and enrolment level 4. So advanced registration would require that the provider and all the staff working for that provider complete the NDIS Code of Conduct training and have an NDIS worker screening check. The organisations would be subject to the complaints process. They'd have to report any incidents, meet practice standards, and their performance would be measured. There would be an in-depth audit for advanced registration and a suitability assessment of providers and key personnel. And there would be ongoing monitoring and compliance. General registration would require that all staff at the provider complete the NDIS Code of Conduct training and have an NDIS worker screening check as well. Again, they'd be subject to the complaints process and would have to report any incidents. They'd have to meet practice standards and their performance would be measured. There would be a proportionate audit, so not as stringent an audit as what would be for advanced registration, and a suitability assessment for provider and key personnel and ongoing monitoring and compliance. So you can see the only difference between advanced and general registration is that the audit process would be a little bit less for general registration. For basic registration, again, NDIS Code of Conduct training for all staff and NDIS worker screening check would be required as well. They'd be subjected to the complaints process and would need to report any incidents. They'd have to meet practice standards and have their performance measured. There would be a suitability assessment of provider and key personnel and ongoing monitoring and compliance. The only difference between basic registration and advanced and general registration is that there would be no audit required. For enrolment, which is the lowest level, again, NDIS Code of Conduct training would be required for all staff and NDIS worker screening check, and ongoing monitoring and compliance would be required as well. All levels of registration and enrolment would also be required to submit their identification and to apply. If you get any in-home support, it would likely come under general registration, is what our understanding is from the review report. Okay. So on the 12th of February, the government announced a new NDIS provider and worker registration task force to provide expert advice to the government on recommendation 17 from the NDIS review, the one about mandatory provider registration. Natalie Wade, a human rights lawyer and disability advocate, has been appointed the chair of the NDIS provider and worker registration task force. Michael Borowick is the former ACTU Assistant Secretary and Training and Safety Expert. He's also on the task force panel. Vicky O'Halloran, the former Administrator of the Northern Territory, is also on the task force. And Alan Fells will be providing part-time expert advice to the task force. He's the former Chair of the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission. The task force will be providing expert advice on the design and implementation of the graduated risk proportionate regulatory model. And they'll also be providing expert advice on a provider risk framework that identifies and evaluates the risk profile of different types of supports and providers. It will also clarify new arrangements for platform providers, such as HireUp, Mabel, Humdrum, and organisations like that. And circumstances where participants directly employ support workers, including Services for One. They'll also provide expert advice on key design elements and implementation of the new provider regulation model so that the changes uphold the rights of people with disability to decide our own best interests, improving our ability to exercise choice and control over the providers that we use. And this is central to the design of the new regulatory model and enabling people who are self-managing in the NDIS, employing and engaging our own workers and providers to continue doing so, and reduce the potential for risk of harm to people with disability by taking a proportionate and risk-based approach to the regulation that considers both provider and support risk and the circumstances of the people who use those services. And increase the quality and innovation of services and supports for all NDIS participants. The task force is going to be working with the Department of Social Services, the NDIA, and the NDIS Quality and Safeguards Commission to report to the Minister for NDIS in the middle of the year. The report is going to give advice on the design and implementation of these risk proportionate regulatory model as it relates to upholding the rights of people with disability to exert choice and control. And that provide a risk framework that identifies and evaluates the risk profile of the different types of supports and providers and arrangements for platform providers and circumstances where participants directly employ their workers. All right, we want to hear from you guys now. If the recommendation for mandatory provider registration is accepted by the government, what will it mean for you? And what do you want the task force to know? And an important note for everyone, this event is being recorded. So by speaking at this event, you agree to have your views shared with the public and with decision makers. If you don't want your words or images used, please let us know before you speak. And if you could keep your contribution to under 2 minutes, that would be really awesome. Thanks, everyone. Okay, and finally, some ways that you can have your say, what you can do next. You can raise your concerns and questions at the next hybrid town hall briefing on the NDIS review. The next one is at 11:30 a.m. to 1 p.m. on Monday, the 19th of the 2nd, 2024. It's at Perth, so that time is in Australian Western Standard Time. You can attend online as well. You can write to the Minister, Bill Shorten, and tell him your thoughts on the recommendations. You can write to the NDIS Provider and Worker Registration Task Force at NDIS Registration Task Force at dss.gov.au. Submissions are currently open and they close on the 28th of April. So you need to get that in soon if you'd like to make a submission. You can write to your local federal minister or MP, and ask for a meeting. You can contact the National Disability Representative Organisations and ask them to advocate for you. Tell them your thoughts and how the review recommendations could impact things for you. We'd also really appreciate it if you could fill out the Self-Manager Hub survey. Doing so will help us with our own submissions and help us to advocate to the government about how these recommendations will affect people self-managing their funding. We'd also really appreciate it if you could support the work of the Self-Manager Hub by joining at selfmanagerhub.org.au, and you can claim this on your NDIS plan. Thank you, everyone.
All right, Amanda, over to you.
Lovely. I'm a mother of a 22-year-old and I self-manage his supports. He is severely disabled, non-verbal, and needs every personal care done for him. We have had experience with registered providers, and every single time the care that he gets deteriorates and he starts self-harming. So we've tried it on a number of occasions, and now we have a team of some through Mabel and some I employ someone personally as well. If they change self-management and they all have to be registered, we are basically going to have no support whatsoever because none of them are registered. I have personally handpicked this team based on the way they interact with my son and the way he responds to them, and they do quite intimate care as well. And I do not want a big registered provider who is literally looking at his bottom line every single time to send someone who has no experience and doesn't even care about the job, does not have any passion for their job, to now then come into my home amongst the rest of our family and give my son less than. He deserves better than less than. I get very emotional about it. We do a great job with his money. We get bang for our buck. We never get fully funded. So we make our money work as best as we can to get him the support that he should be having. To have the government to say, you know what, you're not good enough anymore to do that. We don't trust you, when time after time, the people that are not to be trusted are the registered providers. They have proved it time and time again. I have absolutely zero faith in registered providers. Because my son requires intense care, we will need to have general registration. We're going to lose all our support. And then what happens? What happens when some of the products he needs I can only get off eBay? What do I do then? Some of the splints he needs I can only get from America. What happens then? It is just, they've given us the power to take control and help my son have his best life possible, and now they want to take it away. I am beyond upset. That's all I've got to say.
Hey, Amanda, I just want to say that we appreciate you sharing that. I know it wasn't easy. And also, you're not alone. A lot of us feel the same way.
Hi, thanks, George. I am the mum of 2 adult participants, one with high intensity 24/7 support needs and the other with low support needs. And we self-manage for both. And for my son who needs 24/7 high intensity support, we have a fabulous team that we directly employ, and we use a couple of excellent contractors. The bit I wanted to talk about, so even if Natalie and the task force allow us to continue to self-manage and continue to directly employ, the big concern I've got, even if they solve that piece of the puzzle, is that there's a lot of very experienced women out there who are just serving 1 or 2 NDIS participants whilst they juggle their own care responsibilities or family life stage things or whatever. And that's the case with our 2 ABN holders. Enrolled nurses, experience in aged care, disability care, and educational support, uniquely qualified for my son's complex needs, a depth and breadth of experience that is incredibly rare to get. But the one in particular I'm concerned about is my son is her only NDIS client. No matter how easy they make the system, there is no way she's going to be up for it. Like, there's no way in the world. And there's a lot of women out there with huge depth of experience, women in particular, who are doing part-time, very small-scale ABN service provision to 1 or 2 people, and they will just be lost. And I know they will. And I think it's despicable, and it's a strategy that will weed out the very small businesses that are niche to the needs of particular people, and it will incredibly advantage the big providers. And I'm saying that as a person who's worked as a human services consultant, including for the big providers. I'm not doing it just out of ignorance. And I'm really, really concerned it's going to wipe out the competition from the very small providers, the ones that only have 1 or 2 people. And that will be devastating for us. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, George. Apologies for the background, but the environment I'm in, there are other people that don't wish to be on camera currently. So I have quadriplegia as a result of a spinal cord injury when I was 18. I have high and complex care needs, essentially 24-hour-a-day support needs that involve high-intensity supports with pretty much all personal care and everything else that involves general physical management of life. I've self-employed my own supports for years and years and years, well over a decade now, and under the proposal, I will not be able to continue to do that. Not only as someone who has high and complex care needs, will I be required to be registered, or my workers will be required to be registered. They will be required to undergo annual audits. They will be required to be certified, undergo the certification process with quality and safeguards. All of that is incredibly arduous. And it means that I will be forced to use one of the big providers who I have PTSD as a result of serious assault in my past, and that was as a result of a registered provider. I have zero desire to go back to a big provider that, quite frankly, don't care and cannot possibly provide the level of support that I am accustomed to. And secondly, I've been displaced already from my own home for well over a year now as a result of bureaucratic failure to involve people with high and complex care needs. And the current proposal with the review recommendations is just more of the same. Where they didn't consider us, they didn't actually talk to us. They talked to 1,000 people with disabilities nationally, and the recommendations, sure as anything, don't represent me and my needs, or so many others. And just quickly, finally, I want to echo what other people have said. Some of my consumables, the only place in the country that they're available is like an Amazon store or an eBay store. Those places aren't going to be registered. Those places aren't going to, even if all they are required to do is enroll, there is no way, no hope in hell that those places are going to enroll. And so what do I do then? Because they are literally the only way that I can get those consumables that are entirely disability related. What I will be forced to do is pay for that stuff out of my own pocket. And that's not the promise of the NDIS that I fought so hard for a decade ago. Thanks, George. Appreciate the opportunity to give my piece to this important work. Cheers.
I am in a very similar scenario. I'm an incomplete C2 tetraplegic and require almost 24/7 support in my own home. I have managed to build a independent team of all independent support workers, some who are full-time employees and as well as contractors. One aspect I don't think the government's considered is that my staff would all have to be level 2, I believe, according to the discussions that we had earlier, in that complex bowel management requires level 2 registration, and that comes with a lot of auditing, associated costs, etc. Those costs haven't been shared with us yet. I expect them to be significantly more as you go up the levels. Self-managers often are underfunded, and we make it work for ourselves or our participants by our self-management, by self-employing, by negotiating pay rates, by paying SHADS awards and utilising our savings to stretch our funding further. I can see that if people have to register and do all of these things, it's going to create a significant cost impact for the worker that's got to be passed on somewhere. And that's going to get passed on to the participant and therefore to their plans. And where we can currently employ under the SHADS award and save and utilise that money to stretch out funding, that will no longer be an option, as people will be forced to charge the higher rates. When it comes down to cost savings, which is obviously what the NDIS is attempting to achieve overall, I don't know that they've considered this factor, as well as the fact that, as many people have said, availability of certain consumables or just convenience for parents of young children who can go and buy the disposable continence aids that they need for their young person directly from Coles at often a fraction of the price that they can buy them online through a registered supplier. Again, the cost savings will be gone. Have they considered the cost savings, let alone the human impact, which will be huge? I'm also a nominee for 2 young adult participants, and I've been involved with disability since they were born. Acquired a spinal cord injury myself 4 years ago. So I'm also still a carer and look after 2 other complex plans. So I've got experience with managing supports and engaging support workers for a young teenager who has very different needs, wants, desires to my own needs, wants and desires. And again, it's just going to take away all of what we've all worked so hard for. And I think perhaps an important point for us to make to the government is that cost saving and how much self-managers actually save the government. We're often underfunded. And if their new proposal is a 1 on 3 funding rate, then those 2 are incompatible, in my opinion. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I've been self-managing for my daughter as her nominee for 9 years prior to the NDIS. We have had experience with service providers when my daughter first left school, but my daughter made it very clear right from the outset that she didn't really enjoy the company of other people with disability. So she always gravitated to one-to-one relationships with her support workers. So in 2010, we've had our first foray into hiring directly. Gradually, after using a brokerage arrangement, we employed everyone directly. And in those days, we were hiring ABN support workers. But I have, in the last couple of years, complied with the ruling from the ATO that states that unless the support worker can subcontract to a stranger, that all you do is tell them what to do and they can do it, then if they can't do that, they have to be an employee. So all of my daughter's teams, apart from a team supervisor who doesn't do any direct support, they're all employees, one of whom is a permanent part-timer. She has been with my daughter for 10 years. She also has her own business as a counsellor. So she has reduced her hours and works only on a Friday and a Sunday. But she does this because she wants to keep a relationship with my daughter. They're good friends. And she is the person who we always get any new team members to meet with the first time, and also does their first buddy shift with her. Now, that young woman is not going to be a registered provider. Neither are the other young women who are employed as casual employees, because they are students doing nursing. There's no way in the world, given the struggles I've had ever since the NDIS rollout, to not only attract but to retain support workers who are tire kickers, who move from place to place. So registration is going to deter lots of them, as plenty of people have already said. We have the allied health professionals that we utilise are registered, so that's not an issue. But I'm concerned about support workers, because those people who work for my daughter have allegiance to her, not another entity. People who work for service providers owe their loyalty to who they're paid from, not to their customers. And that has been a huge difference, I noticed, right from 2010, when we started getting people working directly for Lindsay. They were attuned to her needs. They were careful about their own self-awareness and what they brought to the door. People who work for a provider can slacken off, don't pay attention to detail, couldn't give a hoot. And as far as attendance goes, well, you know, there's always somebody else who can just drop in, even if it's totally unworkable, because the replacement worker doesn't know my daughter and doesn't know what to do, which is why we can't use emergency support staff either. So my question about this is twofold. Partly is that I think the NDIA and the ATO and Fair Work either need to get together and waive this notion that the type of provision of support deems you either to be a contractor or an employee, because let's face it, lots of people don't want to do payroll and super and PAYG and STP reporting like I do. I don't actually mind it, but many, many people won't have that wherewithal. Secondly, if they're going to make this continue, then they need to understand that the costs and labour intensity for self-managers are, you know, fivefold after that. And in the long run, this creates a big concern then about registration, because I'm quite happy to become a registered provider for my daughter, but then what happens when I cark it? I'm not here for this world for very long, I don't think, you know, not in the scope of my daughter's lifetime. So if I register a business and then I'm no longer here, what happens then? I think there's many questions to be raised about the registration for self-managers who directly hire and employ support workers. And I guess the other thing I wanted to reiterate is I went to court with my daughter in 1995 to prevent her from being segregated and excluded into a special school. I did this because the vision for her life has always been to be included. There's no way I'm going to allow any government entity to determine that she should be supported 1 to 3 and share her living with other people with disability and share her supports with others. She doesn't like sharing her time with her support workers as it is with anyone else. Even when it comes for training, she gets annoyed if they're talking, doing other things, and the focus isn't on her. So, you know, I don't know what I'm going to do. If they turn around and do this, I would have to cash in what little super I've got and pay for everything out of my own pocket, and then it'll all dry up when I'm gone.
Hi, I'm Janine. I've got a few points to make, so I'll try and keep them short. All the rhetoric around wanting to have everyone registered doesn't actually make sense when it's compared to the results out of things like the Royal Commission that's just been found. They're talking about registration will improve quality. Well, a lot of people's experiences have been that the worst abuses actually have happened from registered providers. They're talking about we want to be able to have the Quality and Safeguards Commission be able to investigate and that sort of thing. But they can already investigate unregistered providers. So what's the difference there? They're talking about trying to stamp out fraud and that sort of thing. And yet they're taking away plan management. And a lot of those people will end up falling to essentially agency managed. And agency managed through registered providers is where a lot of the fraud is most easily able to occur. So I'm standing back and I'm listening to what they're trying to achieve, but all the evidence so far to date says that what they're doing is actually going to do the opposite of what they're trying to achieve. So that's one of my first things. We're not being told the truth about why they want to do this, because if you look at the evidence that they've got, the evidence doesn't support what they're saying they're doing. So that's number one. Number two is when it comes to consumables and assistive technology and those sort of things, they're going to utterly destroy innovation in disability supports. They're going to block access to a lot of assistive technology, because if it's not available in Australia, the supplier's not going to be registered. For myself, I have an autoimmune condition that's causing widespread nerve damage to the sensory and autonomic nervous systems. This results in extreme nerve pain that is triggered by pressure on the skin. I can't type on my fingertips anymore. My computer is my window on the world. I'm a software developer. I use it for all my social interaction with people outside the home. I use it for self-learning. I use it for entertainment. I use it for all my financial things. And so I had to find a way to work around the loss of the ability to type. Tried speech to text, and even after doing all the training for half a day and things, I was still getting 90% error rates. It just was completely unworkable. It also wasn't available for the operating system that I use. It didn't work in the majority of software that I use. It was just a horrendous problem. What we found by experimentation was that if I type on my nails, it avoids putting pressure on the skin, and I can actually type normally. One of the effects of the autoimmune condition, my nails are weak and they break, they shatter really easily. So in order to have nails to type on, I use SNS, or artificial nails, as orthoses. Is every nail salon in Australia going to become an enrolled provider to be able to help people like me who are fairly uncommon, or people who need assistance with things like cutting their toenails on a regular basis? What do you, is that really what the government are expecting? And if they take that away, the cost for me will triple. The risks of getting injured will increase doing it with the support worker, because the salon costs $47. Doing it with the support worker takes 2 hours, and at full rates, that's $130. And it's outside of their scope of practice. They're not trained in how to use the files and things. You're much more likely to get cuts and abrasions and potentially fungal infections as a result of them going with a support worker. I don't have other options. There are no disability supports that will provide the same level of accessibility. The cost of doing this in a year is equivalent to the cost of a license for Dragon Naturally Speaking for a year. So it's not raising costs or anything, but it means that I can still work. It's a huge improvement in the level of accessibility it provides. But it's not an area where people would expect the suppliers to register for, because it's not a normal support that people would think of as a disability support. You've got things like being able to buy a bidet from Bunnings. The same bidet will cost you 3 times as much if you go through a disability assistive technology provider. I've got some specialist sheets from the US where on the fitted sheet, it has a ring that goes around the bed for the fitting part, but then the top sheet actually unzips. And with those, I was actually able to change the bed when we spilt something in it at midnight on a Friday night for the first time in 8 years. Those aren't available in Australia. So we'd still be stuck with laying on towels for a day or two while it dried. There's a whole lot of things like that that mandatory registration is going to cause major problems with.
Thank you. Peter Gregory.
Okay, there we go. Just a few comments here. Firstly, in relation to the task force, I note that Natalie does have a good profile in the development of co-design. I also note the inconsistencies between Natalie's assurances around the co-design process and how she would like to proceed, and Bill Shorten's own statements online to Ray Hadley on the same day that seem to indicate that he's firmly committed to pursuing the registration framework as outlined by the review. So I just think we need to keep an eye on that closely and do what we can to ensure that Natalie and the task force have a unimpeded run at developing their proposals. Secondly, in relation to the card, we've seen this before under Stuart Robert et al. And I think that that experience has demonstrated to us that the card has real potential to be used to monitor and control people's funding, people's expenditure, and to be used in a way that is unscrupulous and limiting on what people can spend the funds on. Also, I am cognizant of the fact that many people simply don't want to engage in transactions with people they're purchasing supports from as an NDIS participant, and therefore, and knowing that when they do, the supplier of the service significantly increases the probability that the charges that they're going to make will be escalated. In relation to the question of registered and non-registered providers, I spend my day almost exclusively with the group of people who would be identified as requiring or needing to have registered providers at the highest level. My day-to-day experience is that the registered providers I deal with deliver substandard, poor quality services and lack the commitment to support people in ways that sees them having access to the opportunities that you would expect if you were looking at the CRPD as a benchmark. By comparison, those people in my lives who are also in the cohort of people requiring significant amounts of support, who choose to use non-registered providers, live far superior lifestyles because they have structures around them that ensure that things are closely monitored, that the risks of exploitation and abuse are removed, and that there is constant exploration of opportunities within their day-to-day lives. So the notion that having registered providers equals quality service, the notion that registration equals safety is a complete and utter fabrication and not backed by evidence. And in my opinion, there needs to be a focus on what participants require from their providers rather than the NDIA dictating what they will receive. And what that means is that even if you have very complex arrangements for your support, you should be able to engage the supports who meet your needs and engage those people on your terms, and that the notion of a risk proportionate response should take into consideration the fact that if you are in circumstances where you have around you the sort of structures and supports and systems and mechanisms that you have designed that keep you safe, then that should be more than enough to satisfy any risk proportionate process system, and that those providers who are currently languishing in a state of garnering millions of dollars off the back of people who they've trapped in group homes, I think that those people need to be held to account to an outcomes framework that requires them to demonstrate quite clearly that they are committed to supporting those individuals to move from that state of dependency, to move into a state of exercising choice and control, and are demonstrating their commitment to creating pathways out of the residential facilities that they've locked them into. That cohort of people that I'm talking about are generally people who've been isolated, excluded, and segregated, and therefore they're the ones who are vulnerable to exploitation.
So I just wanted to give my thoughts about, how self-management, how working with unregistered people has been for me compared with registered. When I first started dealing with NDIS, I didn't know what was what, and we were plan managed, and the support coordinator I had at the time just sort of hooked me up with everyone, and I just let it happen because I didn't know what I was doing. And where I live, there are only two, at the time, there are only two registered providers, big companies. There is only now one registered provider that's a big company and one that's an independent company. I've dealt with both of those registered providers and have caught them out with fraud and other various bad behaviour, none of which has been resolved. Reports have been made to, fraud and quality and safeguards, but nothing's ever happened. So in a nutshell, I'm not willing to work with people like that anymore. And by the by, I have created a team for myself and my son of all non-registered providers, which, it has been still very much a revolving door around here in terms of cleaning and gardening. because, yeah, it's just, I don't know what the deal is with that, but, you just cannot seem to keep regular cleaners and gardeners. But being able to manage that myself without dealing with registered providers, just sending anybody whenever, has been much easier for me. And I just know that, like I've seen a couple of people commenting, or at least one person commenting, about how registration provides a level of visibility and it's about accountability and protections for participants. I'm not buying any of that. I don't think this mandatory levels of registration has anything to do with protecting participants at all. I think it's all about creating a system that NDIA staff are more competent in working within, because, they're clearly overrun with a lot of incompetence at the agency. And yeah, I don't like having worked with big registered people, or even small registered people. What I have found is that when there's an issue, they rally around each other and get their stories straight, and it doesn't matter what level of bad behaviour it can be presented to them. It's very much like, well, that's your word against this support worker. Or, I've had some really bad things happen to myself and my child, all of which nothing can be done about, because it's my word against this support worker who seems to be able to get away with whatever they want. So my experience of dealing with registered providers is that they are less accountable and provide less visibility and less integrity by nature of the size of them and their ability to take advantage of their, I suppose, preferred provider status, because they've got, the NDIS logo or whatever. I think many people still think if they see the NDIS logo that is just instant integrity, and that's absolutely not been my experience, and I know I'm not alone. And where I live, there are no choices. The choice and control is not a real thing where I live. It's choice and control is what providers get to get. So I wouldn't be willing to deal with registered people again. And if it becomes mandatory, my gardener will just say, you know what, I don't need you. I can't be bothered with all that. And, I've got lots of non-NDIS people that I can just go garden for and not have to worry about that. And I suspect the cleaners will be the same too. So yeah, my whole team is unregistered, and I'll lose my whole team. And the way NDIS or NDIA responds to resolving problems that either are made by them and their incompetence, or just system problems, is that it takes months to resolve. And in the meantime, I will lose everybody, because I can't expect my providers to just sit in limbo while I wait for NDIA to figure it out. I certainly don't buy it that it's got really much to do with making sure participants are safe and, getting quality services, because it's not my experience. Thanks, that'll do. That's all.